The winter wind carried more than snow through Clay Hollow that December night. It carried the sound of a child's voice, cutting through darkness like a prayer made of steel. In a world where grown men turned away from screaming, little Lily Carter stood in a doorway and offered her small body as ransom for her mother's pain. Some acts of love are so pure, they rewrite the rules of courage itself, and in that frozen moment, a 6-year-old girl became the conscience of an entire town that had forgotten how to see. Subscribe to witness how the smallest hearts can carry the heaviest truths. The woodshed behind Roy Duggan's homestead held more than split logs and rusted tools. It held the whispered prayers of a woman whose dreams had turned to splinters. May Carter pressed her bruised cheek against the rough timber wall, feeling the December cold seep through her torn dress like judgment itself. Her breath came in shallow clouds that disappeared as quickly as her hopes once had, each exhale a small surrender to the reality that love could wear the mask of a fist. The wind outside howled with the voice of every woman who had ever hidden in shadows, waiting for storms to pass that never seemed to end. Lily's small fingers traced the purple marks on her mother's wrist with the careful attention of a child who had learned to read pain like scripture. At 6 years old, she possessed the terrible wisdom of those who grow up in houses where silence is survival and love is measured in the spaces between blows. Her cornflower blue eyes held depths that should have belonged to someone decades older, pools of understanding that reflected not childhood innocence, but the fierce clarity that comes from watching your world crack apart one violent night at a time. She had stopped asking why Papa Roy's hands turned mean when the whiskey bottle grew light, accepting instead the bitter truth that some questions have no answers worth hearing. The distant sound of boots on frozen ground made May's body tense like a deer sensing wolves, every muscle coiled with the memory of previous hunts. Through the gaps in the shed walls, she could see the yellow glow of the house windows, warm and inviting as a lie told by firelight. Roy would be inside now, probably staring at his reflection in the bottom of an empty bottle, wrestling with demons that always won their battles before dawn. The pattern was as predictable as winter itself, the drinking, the rage, the remorse that lasted just long enough for hope to take root before the next storm arrived to tear it away. Lily shifted closer to her mother, her small body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with the burning determination that lived in her chest like a coal that refused to die. She had seen her mother's spirit bend, but never break, had watched her absorb blow after blow, while somehow maintaining the grace that made her beautiful, even with blackened eyes and split lips. In the child's mind, her mother was not a victim, but a warrior who fought battles no one else could see, who stood guard against darkness with nothing but love as her weapon and prayer as her shield. The shed door creaked open just enough to let in a slice of moonlight that fell across May's face like a blessing she didn't deserve. Sheriff Tucker's weathered features appeared in the gap, his eyes holding the weight of a man who had seen too much and saved too little. His presence brought with it the scent of leather and justice, but also the bitter knowledge that sometimes the law arrived too late to matter. He looked at the woman and child huddled in the corner like refugees from their own lives, and something in his chest cracked with the sound of ice breaking on a frozen pond. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice carrying the careful gentleness of a man who understood that loud sounds could shatter more than silence. The single word hung in the air between them like a bridge he wasn't sure they were ready to cross, an invitation to trust that felt as fragile as spun glass in the winter wind. Behind him, the house stood silent as a held breath, waiting for the next act in a drama that had been playing out in shadows for far too long, while the stars above bore witness to another night when courage would be measured not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of refusing to look away. Sheriff Tucker's knees protested as he crouched down to meet Lily's eyes, his weathered hands resting on his thighs like anchors in a storm that threatened to sweep away everything he thought he knew about justice. The child's gaze held him with the intensity of someone who had learned to see through pretense and straight into the heart of things. Her small face a map of premature understanding that made his throat tighten with unshed grief. In 30 years of wearing a badge, he had faced down outlaws and drunks, had stared into the barrel of more guns than he cared to count. But nothing had prepared him for the quiet devastation he saw reflected in a 6-year-old's eyes. The silence between them stretched like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap under the weight of truths too heavy for words. May's fingers found their way to Lily's hair, stroking the golden strands with the desperate tenderness of someone trying to weave protection from nothing but love and hope. Each gentle touch was both blessing and apology, a mother's attempt to shield her child from a world that had already shown its teeth too many times. The bruises on her arms told stories she wished she could unwrite, chapters of pain that had become the unwanted biography of her marriage to a man who confused possession with love. She could feel the sheriff's eyes taking inventory of her wounds, cataloguing each mark like evidence in a case that everyone knew but no one wanted to prosecute. The sound of a bottle shattering against the house's interior wall made all three of them flinch, the crash echoing through the night like a gunshot fired at hope itself. Roy's voice followed, slurred and angry, calling May's name with the tone of a man who had lost something and blamed the world for its absence. The sheriff's hand moved instinctively to his gun, not from fear, but from the bone-deep understanding that some situations balanced on the edge of a knife, ready to cut anyone who moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. Through the shed's gaps, they could see Roy's shadow moving past the windows, a dark shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Lily's small hand slipped into the sheriff's calloused palm, her fingers barely spanning half his width, but carrying a strength that made him wonder if courage was something children were born with, or something they learned from watching their mothers survive the unsurvivable. Her touch was warm and steady, an anchor point in a world that seemed determined to drift toward chaos. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear certainty of someone who had already made peace with sacrifice, each word falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this frozen night. "He's gonna hurt her again," Lily whispered, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated like the childhood she had never really been allowed to have. The statement held no question, no hope for contradiction. It was simply the acknowledgement of a pattern she had learned to read, like weather signs, as inevitable as winter following autumn. Her eyes never left the sheriff's face as she spoke, searching for something she couldn't name, but desperately needed to find, some sign that the adult world might finally remember how to protect, instead of just punish. The house fell silent again, but it was the kind of quiet that preceded storms rather than the peace that followed them, a held breath that promised violence when it was finally released. Sheriff Tucker felt the weight of his badge like a stone in his chest, the metal suddenly heavy with all the times he had arrived too late, all the women he had failed to save, all the children who had learned to expect nothing from the law but disappointment dressed up as procedure. In the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the stars, and the sound seemed to carry with it the echo of every soul who had ever stood at the crossroads between right and wrong, waiting for someone else to choose which direction the world would turn. The silence that followed Lily's words stretched like a taut rope across the frozen yard, each breath visible in the bitter air, creating small clouds that dissipated as quickly as hope in a place like Clay Hollow. Sheriff Tucker felt the weight of his badge pressing against his chest, a cold metal reminder of promises made to a town that had grown comfortable with looking the other way when darkness crept into the spaces between neighbors. Roy's belt hung loose in his grip, the leather worn smooth by years of use, and Tucker could see the man's knuckles white against the buckle, trembling not from cold, but from something deeper, a war between the whiskey that demanded violence and whatever fragment of humanity still flickered in his chest. May Carter's sobs had quieted to a whisper, Her body curled against the woodshed wall like a broken bird, and Tucker noticed how her hands instinctively reached toward her daughter even as she tried to make herself smaller, invisible. The bruises on her face told stories that the sheriff had heard whispered in the general store, tales that good folks discussed in hushed tones before changing the subject to safer ground like weather and crop prices. Lily stood between them all, her small frame casting a shadow that seemed impossibly large in the lamplight, and Tucker realized that in this moment, this child had become the moral center around which all their choices would orbit. The wind picked up, sending loose snow swirling around their feet, and Roy swayed slightly, his eyes struggling to focus on the scene before him as if seeing it through water. "She's mine," he said again, but the words came out hollow, lacking the conviction that had driven him to raise his hand in the first place. Tucker watched the man's face, searching for some sign of the person Roy might have been before the bottle became his closest companion, before whatever pain had driven him to this frozen yard where a child's courage had stopped time itself. The sheriff's own daughter would have been about Lily's age if she had lived, and the thought hit him like a physical blow, reminding him why he had pinned on this badge in the first place. "Roy," Tucker said, his voice carrying the weight of every decision that had led to this moment, "you need to put that belt down and step away." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge that both men understood would determine not just the fate of this family, but the kind of town Clay Hollow would choose to be. Roy's eyes darted from the sheriff to the child, to the woman huddled against the shed, and Tucker could see the calculation happening behind those bloodshot eyes, the measuring of consequences against the burning need that the whiskey had planted in his chest. Lily never moved, never flinched, her small hands clenched at her sides as if she were holding on to something invisible but vital, and Tucker realized that she was holding on to love itself, refusing to let it be beaten out of existence. The moment stretched until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see which direction the moral compass of Clay Hollow would point when the test finally came. Tucker's hand rested on his gun, not as a threat but as a promise, and he could feel the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing down on his shoulders like the winter sky. Roy looked at the belt in his hands as if seeing it for the first time, and something in his expression shifted, a crack appearing in the wall of rage and whiskey that had driven him to this place. The sheriff knew that whatever happened next would echo through the streets of their small town for years to come, carried on the wind like the scent of snow and the memory of a little girl who had chosen love over fear. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the frozen landscape like a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were still those who kept watch. Still those who believed that morning would come again. Roy's hand opened slowly, and the belt fell to the snow with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire territory, leather against ice creating a whisper that spoke of endings and beginnings all at once. Tucker watched the man's shoulders sag, as if invisible chains had been cut, releasing him from a burden he had carried so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without its weight. The whiskey still burned in Roy's veins, but something else was stirring now, a recognition that pierced through the fog of alcohol and rage, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. May Carter lifted her head slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she were witnessing a miracle she had stopped believing could happen in a world that had shown her only cruelty. Lily remained motionless, her small body still positioned between her mother and the man who had terrorized their nights, but Tucker could see the tension beginning to leave her shoulders as the immediate threat dissolved into the winter air. The child's courage had not wavered, but now it transformed from desperate defiance into something else, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone in that frozen yard. The sheriff stepped forward carefully, his boots crunching in the snow, and bent to retrieve the fallen belt, wrapping the leather around his hand like a symbol of authority reclaimed. Roy watched this action with eyes that seemed to be seeing clearly for the first time in months, and Tucker recognized the look of a man waking up from a nightmare of his own making. "May," Tucker said gently, extending his free hand toward the woman who still pressed herself against the woodshed as if the walls could protect her from memories that lived inside her skin. "You and Lily are coming with me tonight." The words were not a request but a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had finally remembered why he had chosen to wear a badge in the first place. May's eyes darted between the sheriff and Roy, fear and hope warring in her expression, like opposing armies fighting for control of her heart. She had learned not to trust promises of safety, had discovered that hope could be more dangerous than despair because it made the fall so much harder when it inevitably came. Roy stood swaying in the snow, his hands empty now, and Tucker could see the man struggling with something deeper than whiskey, a recognition of what he had become, what he had done to the people who should have been able to trust him most. "I never meant," Roy began, but the words died in his throat, inadequate to bridge the chasm between intention and action, between the man he might have been and the monster he had allowed himself to become. Lily turned to look at him then, her young face grave, with an understanding that no child should possess, and Tucker saw Roy flinch, as if struck by the weight of that innocent gaze. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of wind through bare branches and the distant howl of coyotes, nature itself bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. Tucker helped May to her feet, feeling how she trembled not just from cold, but from the effort of believing that this nightmare might actually be ending. Lily moved to her mother's side, slipping her small hand into May's larger one, and the sheriff was struck by how the child seemed to be the one offering comfort, the one providing strength in a world that had demanded too much from someone so young. Roy watched this reunion with something that might have been regret flickering in his eyes, and Tucker wondered if the man was finally beginning to understand what his choices had cost. Not just his victims, but himself. The sheriff knew that some wounds never fully healed, that some trust, once broken, could never be completely restored, but he also knew that sometimes the first step toward redemption was simply stopping the harm. As they prepared to leave that place of pain behind, Tucker looked back at Roy, standing alone in the snow, a figure diminished by his own actions, and felt something that was not quite pity, but not quite contempt either. A recognition that evil was often born not from malice, but from weakness, from the failure to choose courage when courage was demanded. The wind carried the scent of snow and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, calling travelers toward destinations unknown. The sheriff's office felt like a sanctuary carved from the harsh winter night, its pot-bellied stove radiating warmth that seemed to penetrate not just their frozen bodies, but their wounded souls as well. Tucker settled May and Lily on the wooden bench near the stove, watching as the child continued to hover protectively near her mother, small hands smoothing May's hair with a tenderness that spoke of roles reversed too early, innocence forced to become strength before its time. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Tucker found himself thinking of all the other nights when this office had stood empty while suffering echoed through the streets of Clay Hollow, all the times when good people had chosen silence over action because intervention seemed too difficult, too dangerous, too likely to disturb the fragile peace that wasn't really peace at all. May's hands shook as she accepted the cup of coffee Tucker offered, the warmth seeping through the ceramic and into her palms like a promise that comfort still existed in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. Her eyes kept darting toward the door, as if expecting Roy to burst through at any moment, as if safety were just another illusion that would shatter like ice in spring sunshine. Lily sat pressed against her mother's side, her young face serious in the lamplight, and Tucker realized that this child had learned lessons about courage and sacrifice that most adults never had to face. The silence in the office was different from the terrible quiet of the yard. This was the silence of healing beginning, of breath finally coming easy after too long holding it in fear. "He won't come here," Tucker said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of an oath that he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. "And tomorrow, we're going to make sure he understands that things are going to be different from now on." The words felt strange in his mouth, heavy with implications that would ripple through their small community like stones thrown into still water. For too long, Clay Hollow had operated under the unspoken rule that what happened behind closed doors was nobody else's business, that a man's home was his castle, even when that castle had become a prison for those trapped inside. Tucker knew that changing this would require more than just one sheriff's determination. It would require a town willing to look at itself honestly and decide what kind of place it wanted to be. May looked up at him with eyes that held the fragile beginning of hope, and Tucker saw in her face the woman she had been before fear became her constant companion, before love had been twisted into something that left bruises and broken dreams. "What about tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter this moment of safety and send them tumbling back into the nightmare they had just escaped. Lily's hand found her mother's, small fingers intertwining with larger ones, in a gesture that spoke of bonds that violence could bend but never truly break. Tucker felt the weight of their trust settling on his shoulders like a mantle, and he knew that whatever came next, he would not let them face it alone. The stove crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney and out into the winter night, and Tucker thought about how fire could destroy but also warm, how the same element that could burn down a house could also light the way home for travelers lost in darkness. Outside, the wind continued to howl across the prairie, but inside this small office, 3 people sat in the growing warmth and began to believe that morning might bring something other than more of the same pain. Lily's eyes were growing heavy with exhaustion, but she fought against sleep as if afraid that closing her eyes might make this safety disappear like a dream upon waking. Tucker pulled a blanket from his desk drawer and draped it over the child's shoulders, watching as she finally allowed herself to lean against her mother and let her eyes drift closed. As the night deepened around them, Tucker sat at his desk and began to write letters to the territorial marshal, reports that would ensure Roy Duggan faced consequences for his actions, documents that would help May start a new life somewhere far from the shadows of Clay Hollow, if that was what she chose. The scratch of his pen against paper was the only sound in the office, besides the steady breathing of a mother and daughter, finally able to rest without fear. And Tucker realized that sometimes justice was not about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but about the quiet work of ensuring that courage was rewarded and cruelty was not allowed to flourish in darkness. The dawn was still hours away, but already he could feel its promise in the air, the sense that this long night was finally coming to an end.